All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, for in whatever part of the world you are. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The webinar of today is about strategic scenario planning for the remainder of 2024. Very happy to do this again. We've done this a couple of months ago in March, actually. So we're doing our revised version this time. Same speakers. So I'll introduce the speakers to you in a second. But first, before we go there, a couple of the housekeeping items as normal, right? So on your screen, you will see a sidebar on the right of the main stage. And if at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us and we'll help. We have a help chat located on the sidebar. You can always ask questions in the Q&A tab on the sidebar. We'll make sure to leave some time at the end for you to ask questions and then try to answer them as accurate as possible. And we'll also drop the link of the deck and in the chat by the end of the presentation. Then a very quick legal note. Keep in mind that all the information provided in the session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirement, and we always recommend you to reach out to the Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Good, we've done that. So now let's go over to the speakers of today. Very happy that the same three persons as last time are joining me today to discuss also the same topics, but then obviously quite a few things happen in the meantime. First one is Trine Nielsen. She's our VP of Global Ocean. Welcome, Trine. Then we have Nereus Paskas. He's our VP of Global Ocean Procurement there as well. Welcome, Nereus. And then we have Thomas Kempf, our Senior Director of Air Freight and the business development part, joining us. So very pleased to have these seasoned experts joining me today to give their view on what they see happening in the market. So agenda for today. We will go over, just as last time, we will go over the scenario planning framework. How do we look at scenario planning? Why do we look at it? We will look a little bit more into the driving forces. What do we see happening right now? Then we will look at, okay, now we know what's happening right now. What should we do with it? Or what can we expect? What are the critical uncertainties? And then the now what? And as said, we have time for some Q&A in the end. Let's start with the first part, and the first part is in scenario planning. So why are we doing this? I think that over the last months, or actually years, every quarter or every 6 months, we can all conclude, or we have conclusions saying like, this is not what we expected. Unprecedented times. We did not see this coming. Volatility is there to stay. All of these words that you can put on a nice bingo card for how the market is currently developing are always coming back. So it's extremely important to make sure that you prepare well for what's going on there. Now you can look at that at one time, but you can also make sure that you have a little bit more of a framework in place so that you, on a continuously basis, can look at what do you see happening and what are the scenarios that you need to take into account. And this is exactly why we're doing the same webinar as we've done 6 months ago, based on the same, or actually done in the same structure, but then looking at the new insights that we have coming from the market. So just to briefly go over a recap a little bit of what are we talking about, why are we doing, or how does that, let's say, that's planning spectrum look like, and there's different flavors there, right? And by the way, if you look at, I think both BCG, Deloitte, and PwC have done a few researches on who is actually doing scenario planning, and that's roughly 20 to 30% of the companies are doing scenario planning. Why is it that low? It's kind of complex, takes a lot of time, and takes a lot of expertise to actually do this. So what we're trying to do is also build that framework to actually help you in doing this more often. So that spectrum looks from companies on the left-hand side who will actually say like, we don't do any scenario planning. What we do is we see what's happening in the market. Time will tell us, and we're going to respond to whatever is happening there, and we will use whatever is happening there as an excuse for why, like we can achieve what we can achieve going forward. So that's a little bit like we will see what's happening. Then we have the forecast model, very difficult, right? Trying to forecast whatever is happening in the market. You've heard me say that before. In my view, there's two types of forecast. The first one is lucky, the second one is wrong, right? So forecasting is very difficult to do. A sentence that you hear a lot during speaks or keynotes is like, if I only had a crystal ball. Well, no one has that, right? So that's a tough one. So in our view, let's not try to focus too much on the forecasting part, but focus more on the different scenarios and then the magnitude and the impact of those scenarios. If you take that one step further, you go from scenario planning, you go to linking scenario planning even more to your strategy and the mission of the company. So taking it one step further, actually than purely looking at, for instance, scenario planning in supply chain. If you then, on the other hand, really want to take this to the final stage, is where you build a digital twin model. So a complete replication of how your current setup looks like, where you can actually simulate and test whatever is going on there. It's quite an intensive and expensive model, I would say, but it's extremely interesting and used a lot in the manufacturing industry. We're focusing on scenario planning. So if we look at scenario planning, there's typical 4 steps that we are taking into account. The first one is, what do we see happening there, right? And there's a lot happening in our world, so we try to structure that a little bit. So we try to put all of these things in different buckets. Those are the driving forces. The second part is, now we have identified what's going on. What does that mean for our industry, right? So what kind of uncertainties are coming out of these different events? That's the second part. We will cover that a little bit later. The third part is, now that we know what kind of uncertainties might arise, what are the different scenarios that we need to take into account? So let's come up with some scenarios that we think might or might not happen. And last but not least, if we have those scenarios in place, how do we respond to it? Do we have a way to actually, are we prepared for the different scenarios that we have in there? So this 4-step approach is a very useful and easy framework actually to apply when you want to do scenario planning. All right, let's go into that first part of the driving forces. So for the driving forces, in order to map or categorize those in a specific manner, we use, as we've done last time, the pestle model, right? So what we try to do is we try to say, like, what do we see happening from a legal perspective, from an environmental perspective, tech, etc. So all of the different elements. There's obviously a little bit of overlap between the two. So sometimes you put one in one specific bucket, and it could be in the other one as well. But the idea is, you want to get an overview which is as comprehensive as possible, and that is actually why you put that in a framework like pestle. So that's what we've been doing. That's where we have been focusing on. And what we will do now is we'll go over, just like last time, over those individual elements. So if we go to the first one that we also discussed last time was the legal part, right? So here we look predominantly at maritime and aviation legislation and also regulatory impacts, right? We had a few, the topics that are mentioned here, many of them are coming back from the last time, but there's also a few added in the last 6 months. So I would like to actually ask right now the speakers that I just introduced. So what did you see happening? Are those still relevant? Did you see a massive change there? Is there anything that has been added in the meantime? So maybe from a maritime perspective, let's start there. Trina or Nereus, can you share some light on that for us?
Yeah, I can start out because I think actually what you see here is the exact same topics that we saw last time. And not really much has moved on these topics since the last webinar. So ETS is still implemented. It's a surcharge that carriers are now imposing because they will have to pay
For the
this.
viewers, ETS means?
Oh my God, now I forgot it. It's basically, it's a surcharge to cover for emissions. So the EU is basically imposing charges on carriers for the emissions. It's trading. Yeah, okay. I'll look that up until the end of the webinar, but everyone just calls it ETS now. That's how it goes. We find the fancy abbreviations in this industry, and then people forget what's actually behind it.
I
But
think it's
yeah,
the
so
emissions trading system.
emissions trading system. Thank you. But this is basically, it's become a surcharge that is now being paid. I think the interesting point here will be next year when we start seeing how the trading system actually works in practice. Fuel EU, not really many movements. I visited the port of Rotterdam. They're starting to prepare for vessels getting power from the quay, which is one of the many topics in this legislation, but also no big movement. And on the competition law, we haven't seen much from that either. Yeah, so I think actually what is interesting, because Nereus, you mentioned last time around general average, which is the next topic, and here we've actually seen quite a few things happening.
Yeah, I think last time we said what the general average is and what the risks associated are. And since a few months back, actually, at least 3 incidents happened where general average was declared. One was in Baltimore Port. The incident happened before the webinar, but the general average was announced a little bit after. Then Yang Ming Mobility Ship announced a general average for an explosion that happened at the Ningbo port. And a third one happened for Maersk Frankfurt, a 5,500 TEU ship, due to fire on board. So that's quite a lot for a very short time. And I think it's important to mention again, and maybe remind people that it could be new. Like, sure, a general average got announced, and what's next? It's not only that everyone, including ship owners and every importer, is responsible to pay for basically however much is going to cost to repair everything, but even if your cargo wasn't damaged, your cargo is not going to be released for on carriage or delivery until necessary security arrangements and payments have been made. So it can become very costly. And the longer you don't pay, the more costs will get associated with it, like demurrage. So it's just a big risk. And I think that risk got bigger. And I expect that risk to remain increased. So again, consider insurance, not consider strongly suggest having insurance and making sure it is covered.
Okay, so you're saying, so if it does happen, the cost can be significant, and the possibility that or the probability, if you will, that it's happening has actually probably gone up a little bit more.
It went up, and it's very expensive, meaning it can be in hundreds of millions of dollars, and it will be equally distributed for everyone on board, including importers that may be importing goods that aren't that valuable.
That also means probably that the insurance premiums are going up, right?
That's a good assumption that should be verified.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, okay. That's it's quite a lot indeed. Three in let's say what in 6 months. That's a big number. Hey, if we go to aviation a little bit, to the aviation industry, well, it's not, yeah, it's related to aviation, but also to e-commerce. Thomas, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so on the air freight side, when you look at the major trends, right, you see, of course, the e-commerce and the sustainability. And from a legal perspective, there two things stand out: one on the US side and one on the European side. On the US side, you got the de minimis changes of Section 321, which is a proposal passed forward by the Senate, which we're just waiting and expecting clarification on the details anytime. So that's one thing, and how it will impact, of course, the imports of e-commerce and the strategy of new e-commerce players, right? The Temus and Sheins and some of those big Chinese players, right? Will have to be seen. That probably already covers just a webinar by itself. So I will not take a stand on that one right now, but it's definitely something to consider in scenario planning. The other one is the European Green Deal, EGD. There, I did it the other way because I always forget the abbreviations as well. So don't worry, it happens to the best of us.
Yes.
But so basically, the European Green Deal, metal climate neutrality by 2050, right? It is the strictest legislation passed in any part of the world. So then we have already there intermediate goals put forward to the airlines by the year 2030, with a target to cut the greenhouse emissions by 55% based on the 1990 base levels. That is huge. That is not seen anywhere in the world, and that of course will have an impact one way or another on the competitiveness of European airlines on one side, but also on any players, just like shippers as well, stakeholders, on what that means to operate in the European region. And within that, one more is the Refuel EU policy, which is really the most strict legislation ever seen. It calls for an SAF to account for 2% of total aircraft fuel, and that's starting already next year in 2025. The problem there is the US produces much more of the sustainable aviation fuel than Europe. We got 90% of the production right now taking place in the US for 25. That's what it looks like. 90, that's 90, right? So that's that imbalance between strict regulation on one side, but actually not the production yet, is definitely the two political aspects to consider here.
Okay, all right. The de minimis one, I mean, you're right. We're by the way going to spend a whole webinar on this as well, on the customs element. But it might have a big impact on the on the global dynamics of what's happening, right? Where we're sourcing goods from, right? I think this should not be underestimated what the impact of that will be, right? So essentially, it means if you're lowering the minimis bar, that means that you need to pay more VAT on smaller goods, and that means that a couple of very large shippers, if you will, who have many of those smaller goods, will lose a little bit their competitive advantage, right? And that might have a massive impact on trade, especially in air freight, right?
You're right. So when we look at the data behind this, right, we can see on one side that the average values, and that's just an estimate, right, of this e-commerce come from China into US is anything between $20 and $40. It can be higher, right, but that's like an average best guess. So it's very low. So for the de minimis to actually hit the product, the question is, how low will it go? Right now we're at 800 threshold, right? Will it go lower? And will they add any other specific requirements to it to make it even more difficult to fulfill the requirements actually to and then of course the digitalization part is there, right? How can you on the volume side assure that this doesn't just get stuck with the CBP at the border, right, but gets continues to flow with the e-commerce expectation of quick shipments. So the air freight industry there really has to come together as soon as clarifications are there, and it will create one way or another an impact.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting one to follow then for sure. You talked about the sustainable air freight fuel already a little bit. That's also on the next one, on the environment part. So if we go to that slide, I think we can see there a little bit. We're discussing emissions there. You mentioned that one already, right? The second bullet there.
Yes, exactly. So this one will go a bit quicker. I think one thing is to point out here. You got the commercial interest on one side, of course, and then obviously the global emissions to be reduced on the other hand. Now, where do you strike a balance, right? We can see in the first instance now, a while back for Schiphol airports, certain policies were actually taken back again, right? So this is what we'll expect to continue to see for especially for Europe, where they have very, very strict legislations on paper, but how will this pan out in reality? And on the same page, while the US has not put that much, official legislation on the topic, they're actually doubling down with big investments that are turning to real results as of 2024 already now in terms of production, right? The US accounting for 90% of sustainable aviation fuel production, which basically would mean for European carriers in the future, if anything, import sustainable aviation fuel from the US, which goes a bit against the point of reducing global emissions when you need to transport literally fuel from another continent. So that is a key challenge, I think, for European legislators to balance that. And of course, the future will tell us.
Yeah. But with this actually gaining more traction, more challenges are coming up, and more solutions or measures needs to come into place, which obviously impact our business. So I think we can expect a little bit more here, right?
Definitely. I think just the last point here to answer your question, the CBAM, right, known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that's a big one, right, which it will impact the shippers. It will impose significant reporting requirements, right, and obviously, any shipper working in with a freight forwarder, right, needs to consider the reporting requirements, basically, ideally on a SKU level, right. What are your emissions? What are your costs per SKU, and basically really making sure that you have that somehow ready, because the CBAM will require a very, very, very detailed report on your direct and indirect emissions.
Yeah. This is specifically a topic, obviously talking to a lot of customers as well, which is becoming more top of mind. We hear more and more customers actually talking about this and being concerned about it. So this is a big one, I would say.
Yeah, and globally, not just it started in Europe, right, already a bit earlier, but here in the
Yeah.
US, we get more and more conversations as well on the topic.
Yeah. All right, that's good. Let's go to technology. I think quite a few things happened here as well. Last time we mentioned actually APIs, platform thinking, machine learning, and a little bit of AI. I think it's safe to say that like we really saw a lot of developments going on from an AI perspective over the last 6 months, and I think it moved really to a top emerging trend in our industry. Right? That's what we're seeing now. We mentioned that before in other webinars as well. What we're seeing is, or what we anticipated to happen is that the digitalization gap is actually widening, or those who have data and have good quality data will be able to use the data in a better way, right? And we're seeing that right now. So in the past, you would have data, you have good quality data, but you need the brain power, the analytical power within your organization to actually do something with that. And we saw that a lot of times data was not used in the most optimal way. Right now, there's a lot of actually tools and ways of and large language models that allow you to process the data in a much better and faster way. So what we believe is that the difference between those who actually have that data and are able to use that data will definitely further advance to those who don't, right? So AI is going to create a massive gap there between those two, and we're seeing that happening right now, right? So there's a lot of there's a lot of things, there's a lot of automation possibilities here that we can think of. We within our organization, and specifically also the whole supply chain industry, which is like a series of more than 100 different events, right, that are taking place, or steps that needs to be taken. So it's very applicable for AI, right? So we can see that we can automate more different different steps. We can actually increase quality there, right? By actually checking the data in a better way. We can integrate better. We can use large language models to do faster programming or telling exactly what we want our systems to do. So there's a lot of different opportunities here on how we can use that. And I think internally we have a few good examples there as well of what we're doing. I don't know, maybe Trina or Neris, do you have an example of how we're using that right now?
I can share one of the things, at least, that we are slowly starting to work on, which is related to document parsing.
Yeah.
I think it's no secret that the ocean freight, I think air freight as well, but it's very document heavy, and at least a lot of the documents are now some that we can share via email or something else, and they don't have to go via an airplane as a physical document. But there's still the challenge that there's no global standards when it comes to documentation, also from like customs authorities, carriers, and so forth. So document parsing is one thing that we are now looking at in terms of how can we actually get the system to read the document and update the right information in the right quality into our systems, instead of a person having to sit, in an email, open the document, read through. So this is something that we're already working on, which I'm super excited about, because that will for sure increase quality. But I also think, happiness of jobs or job satisfaction. Yeah. So that's just one example.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
maybe a couple more, but really quick ones. It's not just from Flexport, but also the shipping lines. I don't want to disclose which ones, but are heavily investing in AI, and some of those models have been deployed for, say, booking amendment or SO releases. Like instead of people calling people, you may now call, but someone else may do the job. And I'm not saying it's on a large scale, but they are being tested and seemingly working. So it's happening across the board.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the opportunities are immense, and I think we only have just scratched the surface there. The interesting part is that you can make it extremely small and tangible, right? So you can look at specific actions or specific processes, and then try to see how you can further optimize that. So this will definitely, like leapfrog our industry going forward a little bit more. So we will spend a lot of time actually talking about this topic in the upcoming 6 months. Also doing several workshops at for instance, a Reuters event coming forward in October, I believe. Good one. So yeah, we'll definitely keep a close eye on this and keep everyone involved and informed about at least what we are doing there. So if we then go to the next one, which is social, and with social we also talk about like consumer behavior, those kind of things. There we're actually seeing that a lot of changes in, or at least e-commerce is booming, right? And I think we mentioned that already 6 months ago. That hasn't stopped, right? Contrary, I would say. I think consumer behavior is changing a little bit on that one. Would you agree, Thomas?
Yeah, definitely. And before I answer that one, just to the last one of technology, I think one thing when we talk a lot about AI that gets forgotten, or at least not mentioned as much as it should, is the topic of robotics, right? I think across industries we can agree that robotics are, if you think about it, going to replace huge amounts of jobs, and that's something that we particularly I can testify on the aviation side. We can see in real examples like Schiphol Airport, which has started using baggage robots, which are very concrete examples of what AI in a robotics version, then when you combine that data world and the physical world, will mean for the next year in 2025, where we're going to see much more of that. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah. On that one, on the robot, it's a very good call out because it's obviously more than only AI. I would actually be interested in learning a little bit what our audience thinks about this, and also how they are investing in tech. So maybe let's do a very quick poll here. So like we discussed AI already, but obviously there's a couple of other areas as well. If you would, so I would like to ask the audience to also cast their vote here.
Cool.
What is your strategy there? Invest predominantly in AI and machine learning, or more like the advancement in logistics technology? That's also the robotics part that Thomas just talked about. Data-driven decision making, or increase overall investment? So would be very interested to learn more about that. Wow, that's interesting. So there is a this is a I expect the answer to be a little bit tuned towards what is closest to home for me, right? So where can I make the fastest improvement there? And data driven decision making is a clear winner here, I would say. So that's interesting to see. Very promising, I would say. And AI will 100% help on that one.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks for that. Thanks for the insights. Let's now go to social, to the e-commerce part.
Yeah, as you're already starting with Thijs. So on the e-commerce side, obviously, when we think of consumer behaviors, we all know what's happened in the past 4 years since COVID. Consumer behavior has changed. Expectations have changed to a 24-hour delivery window, not just in the US, but in many other parts like in Europe, and also certain economies in Asia, and also in the Middle East, with a very young generation over there. So I think the two aspects here to call out is, one is the social media as well as the emergence of small brands that goes a bit hand in hand, right? Because you have seen since COVID, the consumer behavior going into more niche brands, more focus on sustainability behind the supply chains of these brands, and them promoting themselves a lot on social media. And one thing where we say, okay, it's not just a generational trend for youngsters or for the younger generations. Older consumers now seem to also follow that trend. That's something we can observe in TikTok, which has already shown a 57% increase among baby boomers, just because they're following the younger generation. But that will translate, obviously, as the entire generation is now age further. That will of course have a further shift, doubling down on this e-commerce. So it's here to stay. And of course, the numbers on the aviation side show that. We currently looking at, and this is citing here Boeing, which has recently released the report, 100 777 freighters daily from China to the US alone to cover this e-commerce demand. We do believe that as these e-commerce companies will mature in the next 2-3 years and have certain capabilities based in the US, in EMEA, that they currently don't have yet to the same extent as some other big players, then that balance between air freight versus building up your inventories locally and then fulfilling from there, that will change. But that will just balance out basically further air freight demand in other aspects. So still nevertheless a growth factor.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of, as you said, a lot of smaller companies mushrooming, growing very fast, but also then disappearing again, right? I guess that makes planning a little bit more difficult, right? Also from a supply side. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree. So you see the threshold to actually trial and error a brand, right, or a product has become very low. You see platforms like Shopify are also obviously us in that field to some extent. New companies on the field in terms of logistics that make it very, very easy for anybody to basically manage your supply chain from factory floor to customer front porch. And we can expect that to increase dramatically over the next 1 to 2 years as it becomes so easy to manage supply chains for anybody via digital capabilities.
Yeah. Last time you mentioned 6 months ago, Thomas, you were too old for a TikTok profile. Did you update your profile?
Oh, you're taking good notes.
Not yet. Work to do there. All right. Hey, social also means looking at labor union or strikes, those kind of developments. There's a few things happening there, right?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Nereus, because it impacts you guys and us.
There was a strike in Canada, which was stopped by the government. People went back to work, and then ILA contract in the United States on the East Coast is expiring at the end of September. And at least where we stand today, it does look quite contentious, so to speak. It's not really a negotiation that's currently happening, but both sides basically said the best we can offer, what we want, is already written down, and they can't agree. And the agreement for now is let's meet on October 1, the day after the contract expires, and then decide. So unless something happens, it's obviously a driving force for companies to ensure that supply chain keeps running if something happens, and something happens is a strike or a slowdown. And a slowdown is also quite affecting the supply chains. Yeah. And I think it's important to say that, since it's a social aspect, if the strike does happen on the East Coast, and after strike, you say it's not a big deal, I'm going to shift my cargo to the West Coast. Well, it happened in the past where West Coast and East Coast kind of complemented each other. And while the strike was on one side, the other side was slowing down. They didn't go on strike because they couldn't, they had a contract, but they wanted to show that they support the strike. And they even had, again, these are a little bit of rumors, but had containers marked that this was previously moving by East Coast or West Coast and now going to the other one. Let's maybe delay this one a little bit more. So there is that social aspect too that we cannot underestimate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we discussed that briefly last time as well, and the fact that there's no solution or whatsoever right now is Yeah, that's kind of worrying, right?
Indeed.
Okay, good. Let's go to the last one. So demand and supply. This is obviously something that we discussed during our freight market updates as well on a biweekly basis. We look at demand, we look at supply outlook, and then what the impact of that is on our business. I think we mentioned it last time already. We did see demand weakening a little bit. We saw a little bit of a bullwhip effect last time, right? Where we did see that customers were actually getting a little bit anxious also about rates and about planning and move their cargo forward a little bit. So we saw a little bit of a peak that we would normally not see. But we do see right now that the global trade is, from a percentage wise, for the remaining of the year, relatively moderate, right? With percentages assumed to be around 2 to 4%. And if there would be an additional peak, then you would add something like 3 to 5% on top of that. But moderate is definitely the word here, if not weak. That's also, it is a little bit spread out per different industries and regions, but it's definitely not a strong outlook. And at the same time, we're seeing obviously supply continue to grow. Maybe Neeraj or Trina, you can share a bit on this side.
Yeah, so supply is growing quite fast this year and also next year. And not every carrier is adding a lot of new capacity. It's actually quite skewed towards a few players. The largest capacity, roughly 600,000 TEUs of new capacity, is coming in from MSC,
Yeah.
the largest global carrier. And the second one is CMA. I believe the number is closer to roughly 250, 100,000 TEUs. Which is very significant. If you add all the carriers, we're talking about more than 1 million TEUs. All of that is going to be delivered in 2025. It is skewed towards a little bit of the second half of 2025. Nevertheless, that capacity will have to go somewhere. And when we speak about capacity, we kind of have to remember Suez. Suez is currently, obviously, all the Suez is closed and the ships are going around Cape Africa, right? So if that does open up, and I don't want to get into that discussion, at least for now, but the supply goes up too. So with 1 million TEUs plus coming aboard, and potentially, and again, that's a big hypothesis, Suez opening or not, all of a sudden supply could go up by more than 2 million TEUs, and all of a sudden you have a huge overcapacity.
In that case, you would see a lot of blank sailings or not?
Yes, so that's what happens when there is too much supply. Well, most common answer would be prices should go down. But, well, that doesn't always happen. Like carriers are in charge of capacity, right? Like they could announce blank sailings, they could reroute if there is too much capacity on one of the services. For example, on TPEB, maybe LATAM is growing. So carriers got a lot better at like directing capacity where it needs to go. A lot of them, like MSC, they don't even have to ask an alliance anymore. They can make those decisions by themselves and very quickly by one sailing. They couldn't even add a port of loading at the sailing happening next week if they see that they have to do that. Well, that's kind of a good thing because it allows them to utilize capacity better, but it also allows them to control capacity better and faster. Anyhow, blank sailings essentially mean that we cannot simply make an assumption that the prices will be going down. That means a lot of uncertainty, right? If blank sailings mean there is a mini peak for that 1 week, and the following week you maybe have too much capacity. That is also not good.
Yeah, yeah. So it's more chaos or roller coasters happening there.
Exactly.
Talking about these alliances, there's a few things happening there as well, I guess, right?
Yeah, so probably most of you have heard of the Gemini strategic cooperation formed by Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk. It starts next year, early next year. Since we're talking about the rest of 2024, like why does it matter? Well, a lot of these services that are currently running on existing alliances, they will have to change between now and then. And not all of the changes have been announced, and we only have 3 months left. So I give you an example. 2 carriers could be running a transatlantic service, and they will be splitting up and launching 2 new services separately. How will it look like? which ports of call will be called first, what's going to be your transit time, will you have to consider a transshipment, like not all of these things can yet be answered.
Yeah.
On core trade lanes like Trans-Pacific, Asia, Europe, a lot of things are announced, but on smaller trade lanes like Transatlantic, LATAM, again, expect more changes, last minute changes, and you have to pay a lot of attention. And Trina, you want to add something on this? Because I may have forgotten something.
Yeah, I think the good news about the Gemini Alliance is that the aim is to deliver 90% reliability, which is almost unheard of. Average schedule reliability right now is 50%. And I guess one of the big things, that at least I'm looking at right now is with Suez not being, basically as they're not transiting Suez, do the new alliances actually have the sufficient ships to set up the networks to serve their customers' business? Because at the end of the day, the new networks will have implications on lead times, including for customers who have contracts on existing alliances, right? So this is what I think for everyone on this call they should look out for. It's like some of these service changes that might impact lead times, or where a service no longer exists.
And the global port congestion is something we should really watch out closely, because especially of the Gemini Alliance, it relies quite a bit on reliability at transshipment points. And I'm not saying it's not going to work. It's just it relies a lot on that. So that's just something to watch.
So essentially, because these decisions are also not, or like what's going to happen is also not entirely clear, might actually make sense on this one to also look at the different scenarios. What is going to happen there, and what should you anticipate, and what could the potential consequences of those be, as you just mentioned. I think that would not be unwise thing to do, I would say. Good. Carrier financials. Anything we want to mention there, Trina?
Yeah, so I think the good news for carriers is that in the first quarter of this year, all carriers except one had a profit. If we look back to last year, not many people expected carriers to make a profit this year. So I think that's good, because essentially everyone needs to survive as a company. Second quarter has also been positive for carriers. The one thing I just want to mention on financials, which I think was pretty interesting, was around June, there was an analysis done by Intel basically highlighting how carriers who have honored their contracts are less profitable compared to carriers who have broken their long-term contracts. Wow. And I think over the past 3-4 months, especially on the Asia to Europe trades, we have seen majority of long-term contracts not being honored. The rates have skyrocketed up, and there's a lot of reasons, including the whole Suez situation, right? So it's a bit unusual. But to me, it's just one of these scenarios that maybe companies should start considering, because it seems like there's incentive to not have long-term deals in this industry. And of course, when it comes to budgeting, I know all CFOs care about the expected cost. It's just some of these things that are extremely difficult to predict what will happen, especially as long as the Suez is not being used.
And Trina mentioned, Matthias, I'm going to jump in a little bit. You mentioned the contracts, right, not being honored. I think it's important to mention that there are two types of fixed long-term contracts. Maybe there are more, but there's index deals too. But some of them are actually enforceable. So when you do sign a long-term contract, you should look into that. And don't expect to get by far the cheapest price. That's also enforceable on both sides. Right, the enforceable contracts last year were significantly more expensive, but when the market did skyrocket, the prices didn't go up. When the prices now are falling down a little bit, they aren't falling down. So again, they are out there. They're only offered by a few carriers. There may be more next year because of the success last year. But again, that's just something to watch. But just like Trina said, most of them, I dare to say more than 75%, were not really working in terms of company signing, not necessarily TUs, because it would be skewed towards the largest 20 companies in the world.
Yeah. I think bottom line here is make sure that you fully understand the dynamics of these contracts and probably go a little bit further than what you used to do in trying to understand exactly what you're getting into. Good. Conscious of time, we need to continue. The politics part, I won't go over that one right now. Firstly, a lot of the things are still very relevant, like we discussed last time. Secondly, we did a whole macroeconomics webinar on this, I think 1.5 months ago, and we're going to do another one. So we will leave this as is right now. So those are the different, let's say, elements of what we see happening in the market. And obviously, we look at the critical uncertainties, and those are just as the last time and very known in our business: reliability, space, and cost. Those are the three most important elements that we need to juggle with and we need to work with, and that's what we're essentially seeing right now. Now, reliability. What can we say there? Last time reliability was pretty low, I would say, right? But did that change from ocean perspective?
No, it's gotten a little bit better, but it's really stuck around the 50% at the moment. And I think initially it was because of the longer lead times to sail south of Cape of Good Hope. But now it's also port congestion that is just continuing to impact. So reliability continues to be unpredictable, I would say.
And I would just add that there are premium services in the market that are running nearly 100% reliably. There are very few, mostly skewed towards Trans-Pacific to US West Coast, but they're out there, and there could be more next year. So something to consider.
Yeah. From a space perspective, you just very clearly discussed that. How about cost? What do we think there? We see rates going down now relatively fast, but I think Trina always corrects me on this. If you look at supply chain cost, never only look at freight rates.
Yeah,
Right?
the price of the container is by far not the cost of moving your shipment. There's so much hidden cost that everyone should consider on the price. So a premium offer, like Nereus mentioned, can actually sometimes have lower cost to your company depending on whether you're going to face a stock out, and also the challenge, I think, over the past 3-4 months, and obviously right now the situation is easing a little bit, but it's really been that there's been too little space available for the demand, which of course has increased the cost of a container, but it's also increased the, I would maybe call it the opportunity cost, because basically it's also been much harder to get your container loaded on the ship, which means that you can face 1, 2, 3 weeks of delay, which in the end will have a much higher cost than paying for a premium service.
Yeah.
So yeah, the price of the container continues to fluctuate, and right now I think most shippers are happy it's going downwards and very fast. But yeah, I think in terms of scenario planning and budgeting, doing predictions for cost in this environment, I think, is extremely difficult. I mean, we're even doing it internally, right? Trying to predict what are freight rates next year. And there's so many critical uncertainties. So we're also working with scenarios.
Yeah.
I just add, like, I think in this market, it's useful to consider things like index contracts that you don't necessarily have to think too much what happens in the market. You pay the right price. There are more indexes that are emerging or offerings index rates, could be monthly, quarterly, or even weekly. That's one. And the second point I wanted to mention on the premium services, what Trina mentioned, right? When the market is, container ship is more or less a little bit commoditized. Of course, there is differentiated offerings, but it is commoditized. So as more supply comes in, prices are falling. This is what we're seeing. But the interesting thing to note is premium services have not seen a single reduction, even though market opened up. That simply tells me that if you do create value and differentiate yourself, you actually can keep the higher price. Customers are willing to pay for that. So
That is interesting. That hasn't always been the case, right? We have seen actually
the
quite
spread
some.
between premium and regular has been growing ever since COVID.
Yeah.
And now it's in more than double
Yeah.
premium services, the
Yeah.
price.
Good. Hey, Thomas, from an air freight perspective, cost-wise, or any developments there, or any things to call out?
Yeah, I think to call out here for Q4 and as we go into Q1, out of Asia, space will be tight, and we're already on a high rate level, right? We slowly rates were creeping up, especially out of China in the first half of the year, and we're now at quite a high level where we stabilized. We do see already first indicators of that going further up. So on the Asia, the Trans-Pacific eastbound lane particularly. So that's one element to watch. The other thing is, of course, we have seen the political unrest in Bangladesh, which is the, I think, third largest producer of clothing, right, in the world, which definitely have an impact on air freight. And then, of course, the Middle East uncertainties, which will also one way or another further have an upside effect on the rate levels. The one region that we can expect stability to continue is the transatlantic, so US exports to Europe and European exports as well to the US. That trade lane, the transatlantic trade lane, to expect it to remain steady.
Got it. Like it's always a slightly more stable trade, right? I would say.
It just goes with seasonality trends, right? So when you have the summer capacity coming in, you have more capacity available. So rates usually drop a bit there. That's usually 31st of March to 31st of October, the summer schedules of the carriers. And then as we go now, we already see capacity being taken out late August, right, on the transatlantic, and then rates in line also. The second driver, of course, the seasonality, then picking up again with Q4. So
right. Okay. Tricky question here. What do we expect rates to do in Q4 on the core lanes?
I guess let's start with ocean. The big unknown is Golden Week. Golden Week is October 1 through 7th, right? How many blank sailings are carriers going to announce to deal with when, as mentioned, China is closed for 7 days? There's a lot less demand. September is supposed to be a little bit of a peak, but instead of a peak, we see volume slightly declining. So it's trending towards rates should continue declining in Q4. But the only thing to watch is what happens after Golden Week, and that happens pretty soon. So we can answer that question much better in 1 month. But again, for now, the indications are that unless more blank sailings are announced, we should see at least slight reductions across the board. Trans-Pacific, Asia, Europe. Transatlantic, maybe not so much. That market is actually running quite good.
Got it. Air freight. Any last things there, Thomas?
Well, I think the only thing really to note here is, especially from China to Europe, it's because of the restricted airspace issues, Russia and Ukraine driven, we see some carriers now actually stopping certain routes, passenger routes, so known as belly routes for the aviation people amongst us here. And there we can see, for example, Virgin Atlantic has recently, after 25 years, stopped services from Shanghai to London. Now that has an impact, right? Because generally, give or take, right, globally, we're talking about 60% of the air freight capacity coming from bellies and 40% from freighters. So wherever the passengers go, we get that extra air freight capacity. So particularly from China to Europe, that's a call out I would make here, that this is something to be watched. And of course, Middle Eastern carriers who are geographically better positioned, because anyways it has to go via a little detour via the Middle East. But those carriers are actually growing quite strongly right now because of this political instabilities. So something very, very interesting to watch in terms of rate developments.
Definitely. We'll continue to watch that. All right. We have 5 minutes left. Luckily, not that many questions, so we can cover the last part in the 5 minutes. So we've discussed all of the different things that we see happening in the industry. We've looked at the critical uncertainties, and now, just as last time, we've been looking at, so what are the different scenarios that we can think of and that we think are going to happen. And obviously, we will share those with this audience as well. So you will either get the slides or you can listen to the recording. But how have we been doing this? We've been using all of the information that also was just shared during this webinar. We then plotted, you can see that on the next slide a little bit, how we've done that. We've looked at what kind of scenarios do we think are going to be relevant, ranging from smooth sailing, right? So supply and demand being more in balance, from Red Sea reopening, etc., from the other different ones. And then we have identified per the scenario, what are the events that need to happen for those scenarios to actually materialize. And we put those traffic lights in there, and that in the end resulted in the probabilities that you see in here, right? So that's the first part that we've done. The second part is then we linked it to the different scenarios, the probability to what do we actually expect to happen there. Do we think that operational bottlenecks will increase, freight costs, etc., on-time delivery? So all of the points that we discussed today are then in this overview again. Now, what should you further do with this? So on the next slide, you can see the different probabilities, and obviously, I would recommend you on the next one. Obviously, I would recommend you to look at it yourself, to have your own assessment there with all of the information that you have. And then the idea is that you would look at what are the implications here. And here you try to balance between short-term tactical responses, right? So what do I need to do tomorrow to actually make sure that I'm ready for all of those things that are happening? And how do I look at longer-term coping strategies, right? So those are a little bit more like going forward. What you try to do then is you try to build an integrated decision framework, which means I look at long-term or short-term tactical responses, but at the same time, I see what the impact of that is going to be on my longer-term coping strategy. So integration of those two is definitely very important. Last but not least, continuous improvement is definitely something that you need to constantly watch at, because like it's all changing relatively fast. By the way, if you have your RFP coming up, I would highly recommend you to actually put also continuous improvement as one of the decision criteria in there of how you're being helped as a company there. So if you look at those 10 different elements there, then you could actually also on the next slide do a little bit of a checklist. All of those elements are on there, and we're more than happy to share more with you on how we are doing this. But this is how you look at it. You look at the scenarios, and then you can say, like, am I ready to actually to weather all of these different scenarios or storms that are going to be thrown at me? You see them here. It's very simple, right? So the more you tick, the more of those boxes you tick, and you can assess yourself a little bit also, or you can ask us to help you with that. You can assess which of those boxes actually you have in place or not, and that determines a little bit how ready am I to cope with all of the different scenarios you have in there. So we will share all of this. This is the let's say maybe an action item that you can take from the webinar here. We are 1 minute before time, and we are actually at the end already. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I think and I hope that our three panelists have answered already a lot of questions, at least a lot of questions that I have. So thank you very much, Trina, Thomas, and Nereus, for joining me on this on this webinar. I hope it was insightful, and we will continue to do this, because one thing we know for sure: in 6 months' time, the market will look drastically different again, and we need to pivot and we need to course correct whatever we're doing. Hope you found it insightful. Thank you very much for attending, and look forward to see you again. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.